The moment the bank teller slid a folded note across the counter to me, my heart stopped. I hadn't even finished signing the withdrawal slip. She was young, maybe 28, with dark braided hair and a name tag that read, Desiree. Her face was completely neutral, professional smile, eyes forward, but her fingers pressed down on that note like she was trying to push it through the marble counter. Please don't complete this transaction. Sit down in the waiting area. Tell them you forgot your ID. I will explain everything in 10 minutes. Please trust me. I looked up at her. She gave me the smallest shake of her head, almost invisible. My name is Dorothy Callahan, though everyone who loves me calls me Dot. I'm 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Denver, Colorado, and I have been navigating this world alone for 3 years. Ever since my husband Gene passed from a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while he was making oatmeal in our kitchen. 43 years of marriage and he was gone before the oatmeal finished cooking. That morning at the bank, I had come to withdraw $180,000. My nephew had asked me to. Let me back up, because I know how that sounds. I know how all of this sounds. But I need you to understand who my nephew Kyle was to me before I can explain what he almost did. Kyle was my sister Patrice's only child. Patrice died of ovarian cancer when Kyle was 19, and from that point forward, I became the closest thing to a mother he had. I flew to Phoenix 3 times a year. I called every Sunday. When he got married at 26, I sat in the front row and cried happy tears the way his mother would have. When the marriage fell apart 4 years later, he called me from his car in a parking lot somewhere, crying so hard I could barely understand him, and I stayed on the phone for 2 hours until he could drive home safely. Kyle was family. Kyle was the family I had chosen to keep after Gene died. So when he started coming around more often after Gene's funeral, I was grateful. He lived in Colorado Springs, only an hour away, and suddenly he was visiting twice a month, offering to help with the gutters, bringing groceries, sitting with me on the back porch, and talking about Gene like he missed him too. I thought grief had brought us closer. I thought losing Gene had reminded both of us how short life was. I should have noticed the questions. At first, they were gentle. How are you managing everything, Aunt Dot? The house, the finances. It's a lot for one person. Then they got more specific. Did Gene leave a pension? Is the house paid off? What does your financial advisor say about your portfolio? I answered honestly because it was Kyle. Because he was 29 when his mother died and I had promised Patrice I would look after him. 6 months after Gene passed, Kyle suggested I consolidate everything, my savings, Gene's life insurance payout, the investment accounts, into one place. It'll be easier to manage, Aunt Dot. Less confusing. I know a guy at a wealth management firm. He's great. Very trustworthy. I let him make the introduction. The advisor's name was Trevor. Trevor had a firm handshake and a very nice office, and he talked for 45 minutes about diversification and low-risk returns and protecting my future. And I nodded along because Gene had always handled this part of our lives, and I was 64 years old and I did not know what I did not know. I signed the paperwork Trevor put in front of me. 3 months after that, Kyle mentioned that he was looking at a business opportunity. A restaurant space in downtown Colorado Springs. Incredible location, reasonable lease, the kind of chance that only came around once. He just needed a small bridge loan to cover the deposit while his financing came through. Just $60,000, Aunt Dot. I'll have it back to you in 90 days, I promise. I wrote the check. It was Kyle. The 90 days came and went. When I asked about it, he apologized beautifully. The financing had been delayed, some bureaucratic issue with the SBA. It would absolutely be resolved by the end of the month. He brought me flowers when he said it. He hugged me at the door when he left and said, I don't know what I'd do without you. I believed him because that is what you do when you love someone. You believe them. That was 14 months ago. The morning I walked into First Mountain Bank to withdraw $180,000, I believed I was helping Kyle save his business. He had called me the night before, his voice tight with controlled panic. The restaurant is hemorrhaging money. The equipment loan is coming due. If I don't cover it by Friday, they're going to liquidate everything. I will lose it all, Aunt Dot. Everything I've built. He had done the math for me on the phone. He needed $180,000 to bridge the gap, just until the investor he'd been in talks with signed the term sheet. 3 weeks, 4 at the most. I would never ask if I had any other option. I told him I would go to the bank first thing in the morning. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was suspicious. I wasn't. Not yet. But because $180,000 was almost everything left in my liquid savings, and some part of me, some quiet animal part that does not speak in words, was uneasy in a way I could not name. I got to the bank when it opened at 9. I filled out the withdrawal slip. I slid it across the counter to Desiree, and she slid a note back. I stood at that counter for 3 long seconds, reading the note a second time, then a third. My hands were not shaking yet. That came later. In that moment, I was simply very still, the way you go still when something shifts beneath your feet and you are not yet sure if it's an earthquake or your imagination. I forgot my ID, I told Desiree. I'm so sorry, I'll have to come back. Her expression didn't change. Of course, ma'am. These things happen. Why don't you have a seat while you check your bag, just in case? I sat in one of the upholstered chairs near the window, the kind banks put out to make you feel like this is a comfortable place to be. I set my purse in my lap and I looked out at the parking lot and I thought about Jean making oatmeal. I thought about Kyle at 19, folded into himself at his mother's funeral, so small inside his suit. 12 minutes later, a woman sat down in the chair next to mine. She was in her early 40s, black, with natural hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was wearing a lanyard that I assumed meant she worked at the bank, but she introduced herself quietly and told me her name was Renata Webb, and that she was a financial crimes investigator with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, currently on assignment embedded with First Mountain Bank's Fraud Prevention Unit. She had been watching my account for 6 weeks. Mrs. Callahan, she said, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to understand that you are not in any trouble. But I also need to be honest with you about what we found, because what you were about to do this morning would have been very difficult to undo. I remember thinking that the sunlight through the window was very bright. I remember thinking that the chair was surprisingly comfortable. I remember not being able to feel my hands. How much do you know, she asked carefully, about Trevor Holt's investment firm? Trevor? Kyle's friend with the firm handshake. He managed my... I consolidated some accounts. Kyle introduced us. Renata nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they already knew the answer and were hoping to be wrong. Mrs. Callahan, Trevor Holt's firm is not registered with FINRA. It is not registered with the SEC. The office address he gave you is a shared commercial space that he rents by the hour for client meetings. The investment accounts he opened in your name are real accounts, but the beneficiary on all of them was changed 4 months ago to your nephew. The sunlight was still very bright. The $60,000 you lent Kyle 18 months ago, she continued, was transferred within 48 hours to a personal account in Kyle's name in Nevada. The account has been used exclusively for personal expenses. There is no restaurant investor. Our records indicate the restaurant itself is not in financial distress. In fact, it appears to be doing reasonably well. The emergency he described to you last night does not match anything in the business's actual financial picture. I heard myself say, very quietly, then why does he need the money? Renata paused. She had the face of someone who has delivered bad news many times and has never found a way to make it land softly. Our working theory is that he doesn't. We believe this withdrawal request was designed to capture your remaining liquid assets before you discovered what had already been moved through Holt's firm. If you had walked out of this bank this morning with $180,000 in a cashier's check made out to a Shell LLC, that money would have been in Nevada before you got home, and recovering it would have taken years if it was possible at all. I sat with that for a moment. 43 years, Jean and I had saved. We hadn't been wealthy people. Jean was a civil engineer for the city. I taught fourth grade for 31 years. We drove sensible cars and took one real vacation a year and put money away every single month. Because that was how you built a life. That was the agreement we'd made with the future. How much, I asked, has already gone, she told me. $230,000. Moved in increments, structured to avoid automatic fraud triggers, routed through 3 different accounts before landing in Nevada. Kyle and Trevor had been patient about it, methodical. The first transfer had happened 11 days after Jean's funeral. 11 days. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because people always assume that's what happens, that you cry, you fall apart, you need someone to hold your hand. What I felt was something colder and more clarifying than tears. It felt like standing in a room where all the furniture has been removed and the walls are suddenly very visible. Everything was still, and I could see everything clearly, and I understood for the first time in 3 years how completely I had not been paying attention. What happens now? I asked. Renata explained it the way someone explains something to a person they believe is capable of handling it. Kyle and Trevor were already under investigation. The withdrawal request that morning had given them enough to move forward. There would be arrests, probably within the next few days. There would be an asset freeze on the Nevada accounts. A forensic accountant was already reconstructing the paper trail. I would likely recover most of it, though the legal process would take time. I need to call my daughter, I said. My daughter Melissa lived in Nashville with her husband and my 2 granddaughters. She was 38, a labor and delivery nurse, which meant she had spent her entire adult life in rooms where things were urgent and real, and there was no space for pretending. She had asked me twice in the past year whether I was sure about Kyle, whether I'd looked at my own accounts recently, whether I'd had anyone independent review what Trevor had set up. I had told her both times that I appreciated her concern, but that Kyle was family and she didn't need to worry. She answered on the first ring. Mom? It's 7:30. What's wrong? I told her where I was and why. I told her what Renata had told me. I listened to the silence on the other end of the line that was not really silence at all, but Melissa holding herself very carefully together. I'm booking a flight right now, she said. You don't have to. Mom? Her voice was firm and gentle at once, the voice she probably used with new mothers in the delivery room, the voice that said, I am here and I am not leaving and we are going to get through this. I'm booking a flight. I will be there by tonight. Don't sign anything. Don't talk to Kyle. Don't answer any calls from numbers you don't recognize. Okay, I said. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. I gave my formal statement that afternoon in a small conference room at the bank, with Renata and a colleague of hers named Detective Aaron Briggs, a quiet man in his 50s who took notes by hand and asked questions that sounded simple but weren't. They showed me documents I'd signed, some I recognized, some I didn't. Trevor had apparently brought additional paperwork to our second meeting after I'd relaxed. And I had signed things in the middle of a stack without reading them carefully because Jean had always read the middle pages, and I had trusted that, and I had kept trusting it out of habit even after Jean was gone. That was the thing that was hardest to hold. Not that Kyle had done this, not even the money. It was that I had kept living as though Jean were still in the next room, as though someone else was reading the middle pages, and no one was. No one had been for 3 years. And I hadn't noticed because grief will do that. It will let you keep pretending for a very long time if you let it. Melissa arrived at 8:45 that evening. She came straight from the airport to the hotel where Renata had arranged for me to stay while they processed the scene at my house. Kyle had a spare key, had had one for 2 years, and they needed to document whether anything had been removed. Melissa walked in with her carry-on and her coat still on, and she held me for a long time without saying anything. Then she sat down, opened her laptop, and started making calls. Melissa had a friend from nursing school who had gone to law school instead, a woman named Priya who specialized in elder financial exploitation cases. Priya was on the phone with us inside an hour, taking notes, asking questions, explaining the civil recovery process in language that was clear and unsparing. She had handled cases like this before. The good news, Priya said, is that they were sloppy in one important way. They kept the money in accounts they controlled directly. That's recoverable. It takes time, but it's recoverable. Why were they sloppy? Melissa asked. Because they thought she wouldn't catch it, Priya said simply. I thought about that for a long time afterward. They thought I wouldn't catch it. They had built the entire scheme on that assumption that I was a grieving widow in her 60s who didn't understand financial instruments and would keep signing things put in front of her because that was what she had always done. They had used my grief as a blueprint. They had mapped the exact dimensions of what I didn't know and built a theft around the edges of it. They had known me well enough to know where I was blind. Kyle was arrested on a Thursday morning, 4 days after I sat in that bank chair and read Desiree's note. Trevor was arrested the same morning at his rented office where he was apparently meeting with another client, an elderly widower from Aurora. I learned later that I was the 4th victim they had identified, though the first to be intercepted before the final transfer. The other 3 had lost everything. One woman in her 70s had lost her home. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard he'd been arrested. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to grief, which I know sounds strange. Kyle was the last piece of Patrice I had in the world. He was 19 at his mother's funeral, too small inside his suit, and somewhere between then and now, he had become someone who spent 11 days waiting after my husband's funeral to start stealing from me. I would spend a long time trying to understand how that happened. I'm not sure I ever will. The trial took 7 months. Melissa came back for every significant hearing. Priya represented my civil interests with a focus and a precision that I found deeply reassuring. She never let me feel like a victim in the courtroom, always positioned me as someone who had been wronged and was there to set the record straight, which is a different thing, and it mattered. Kyle's attorney argued that I had gifted him the money, that I had understood what I was signing, that the transfers represented a pattern of familial generosity freely given. I sat in that courtroom and listened to a narrative about myself that was constructed entirely from my own kindness, and I felt something that I can only describe as a clean and very specific anger. Not hot, not loud, but permanent. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Kyle received 7 years. Trevor, who had 4 other victims and a prior conviction for securities fraud in another state, received 11. I sat in the courtroom steps with Melissa afterward, in the November cold, and I didn't say anything for a while. She didn't push me. I kept thinking I'd feel better when it was over, I finally said. Does it feel over? I thought about it honestly. It feels like the first day I can start. Rebuilding was slower than I expected and more interesting than I feared. Priya's civil process recovered $198,000 of the $230,000 within 14 months. The remaining amount was tied up in appeals that I eventually settled for less than I was owed because I was 67 years old and I wanted my life back more than I wanted to spend it waiting for a resolution that might never be fully satisfying. I took a financial literacy course at the Denver Public Library, the same library where I had taken my 4th graders on field trips for 20 years. I sat in a folding chair with a workbook in my lap, and I learned how to read a brokerage statement and how to verify an advisor's FINRA registration and what a beneficiary designation actually meant. The instructor was a retired CFP named Harold, who was in his 70s and had the patience of a very good teacher, which I recognized immediately. After the 3rd class, I told him I was the reason I needed the course. He said, "Most people here are." And then, because he was a good teacher, he moved on. I called Desiree at the bank 2 weeks after Kyle's sentencing. I had thought about it for a long time, whether to reach out, whether it would seem strange. But she had put a folded note on a marble counter and pressed it down with her fingers, and that was the hinge on which everything else had turned, and it seemed wrong not to say so. She answered with the careful, professional voice of someone who does not yet know if a call is good news or bad. I told her who I was. "Oh," she said. A small sound but warm. I asked her how she had known. She told me that she had flagged the account 6 weeks earlier, when she noticed the pattern of beneficiary changes across multiple linked accounts. It had crossed her desk as part of a routine compliance review, and something about the timing relative to account activity had looked wrong to her. She'd mentioned it to Renata's unit. They had been watching since. "When you came in that morning, Desiree said. I recognized your name immediately, and I could see from your face that you had no idea. I didn't, I told her. I had no idea at all. There was a pause on the line. My grandmother lost her savings to a home repair scam when I was in high school, she said. She'd saved for 40 years and it was gone in a month. We never got it back. I went into banking specifically because I wanted to be the person who could stop that from happening to someone else. She paused again. I'm glad the note worked. It saved everything, I told her. I volunteer now with the Colorado Adult Protective Services Financial Exploitation Task Force. I go into community centers and senior living facilities and library meeting rooms with a printed handout and a patience that 31 years of teaching fourth grade gave me, and I tell people what the red flags look like. I tell them what I missed. I tell them that the people most likely to exploit them will be the people they love the most, and that understanding that is not cynicism. It is simply knowing how these things work so that love can be offered more wisely. Renata comes to some of those sessions. She brings case studies, anonymized, carefully edited, and we take questions together. She is rigorous and kind in a combination I recognize from the best people I have known. Melissa moved to Denver 14 months after the trial. Her hospital had a position and she took it, and she told me plainly that she wanted to be closer. Not because she thought I needed supervision, but because she wanted her daughters to grow up knowing me the way I deserved to be known. I pick them up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We bake on Saturday mornings. They know nothing about Kyle except that he made some bad choices and lives somewhere else now. They know everything about Jean. I have made sure of that. There is a photograph of Jean and me from 1987 on the bookshelf in my living room. The one that used to be across from where Kyle would sit when he visited. For a long time after everything happened, I couldn't look at it without feeling the loss inside the loss. Jean, and then the version of Kyle I had believed in, and then the 3 years of grief during which I had not been paying attention. But I look at it now and I mostly feel Jean. He was not a complicated man, my husband. He was steady and consistent, and he showed up the same way every single day for 43 years. And I think I understand now what a rare and undervalued thing that is. Not dramatic, not a single grand gesture, just showing up the same way, day after day, until the shape of it becomes the shape of your life. Desiree showed up. Renata showed up. Melissa showed up. Harold with his folding chair and his patient teaching. They showed up the same way Jean showed up, quietly, consistently, when it mattered. I am 67 years old and I know my account balance to the penny. I review my statements every month, first Saturday morning with coffee at the kitchen table where Jean used to do the same thing. The window open if the weather allows. I have a financial advisor now, one I found through FinRay's independent broker check tool, one whose registration I verified myself before I signed a single piece of paper. I am not the woman who sat in a bank chair 3 years after her husband died and did not know what she had been signing. I am someone who came from her, but she is not who I am now. Last fall, I got a letter from Kyle's attorney. He wanted to communicate that Kyle was taking a rehabilitation program seriously, that he expressed remorse, that he hoped one day I might be open to communication. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and put it in a folder in my filing cabinet under a tab I labeled Correspondence. No response required. Maybe one day. Maybe not. That is not a decision I need to make today. What I know is this: grief will make you live in the past tense if you let it. It will keep you setting 2 cups out for coffee, keep you waiting for someone to read the middle pages, keep you inside the shape of a life that no longer has the person in it who made that shape make sense. And while you are living in the past tense, the present tense goes entirely unguarded. I guarded nothing for 3 years. I left the doors open and I called it love. But I learned something from a young woman who pressed a note down on a marble counter and trusted that a stranger would be brave enough to listen. Love is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as inattention. You can love fiercely and still read the middle pages. You can love completely and still know your account balance. You can hold someone in your heart and still see them clearly. And sometimes, seeing clearly is the most loving thing you can do. For yourself. And for everyone who ever showed up for you the same way. Day after day until the shape of it became everything. Did this story resonate with you? If you or someone you know has ever felt something was wrong but couldn't name it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you found value in this story, please share it. You never know who might need to hear it today.